Why would you... Hey YouTube, it's me, TJ DeVries, here to talk about a term that I hope can sort of answer this question that I often get, which is basically, why would you use Neovim? Right? And the answer actually doesn't necessarily revolve exclusively around Neovim. I think it actually revolves more broadly around this term that I want to call PDE. PDE stands for Personalized Development Environment. Today I'll explain both what I mean by that term, and hopefully it sort of gives some new clarity between text editor and IDE, as well as show a few things about why Neovim is a good candidate for being a PDE. So I hope you enjoy this talk. If you have questions, concerns, anything like that, leave them in the comments. You know what to do. Thanks everybody. Let's get to it. So let's give a little context first. This term PDE first occurred to me when people...
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. كيف حالك أعزائي وكيف الصحة؟ كيف العشر الأواخر معك؟
Were asking me, do I think Neovim is a text editor, or do I... If you have questions, concerns, anything like that, leave them in the comments. You know what to do. Thanks everybody. Let's get to it. So let's give a little context first. This term PDE first occurred to me when people were asking me, do I think Neovim is a text editor, or do I think it's an IDE? And my answer was basically, I don't think that it's either of them. When I think of a text editor, I think of something that is exclusively focused on editing text, which I don't think Neovim's exclusive focus is on that. We ship with an LSP, we have tree sitter, we have some things that are beyond just the literal editing mechanics of moving text around, right? But it's also not an IDE. You don't open it up and it doesn't start like indexing your projects or doing anything like that for you. It still requires you to do things. So when people ask me that question, I can understand why they would be confused, because when they open Neovim, it sure looks just like it's only a text editor, right? You can't do anything exciting by default, cryptic menus, etc., etc. I think some of those things are maybe overblown, but that's beside the point, right? And you can see how someone who opens that up is going to think, this is useless. People do this just for gimmicks. But on the other hand, you know, after you've used Neovim for a while, I think, wow, I have a lot of features in here, and I'm going to show some of those later. And so I think this spectrum really doesn't answer the question of, one, why would you use Neovim, and two, what can you do with it, right? And I want to show you both of those things. So first off, let's define the term then. If PDE is not a text editor or an IDE, what is it? So I would say the first defining feature of what a personalized development environment is that you must have some assembly required. Now, immediately, this is going to turn some people off, and they're not going to be interested in doing that. And to that, I say, that's great. It turns out the software development world is big enough for people to have different opinions, different desires, different definitions of fun. That's okay. But I want it to be clear, the first thing in my sort of definition of what a PDE is that you're going to have to do some work on your own. That's the personalization part. And that can come in a variety of different factors, which we'll show. Additionally, a PDE must have the ability to support the coding basics, right? So, and by this, I just mean you're not opening up notepad.exe, right? It has syntax highlighting, it's got folding, it's got indentation. You know, it's not writing in Notepad, it's not writing in Google Docs, for example, right? So that's definitely a bare minimum requirement for a PDE, but that is also shared with, I think, most text editors. But beyond that, it also needs to have something that I like to call code intelligence, which by that I just mean it understands the code as more than just text or the bytes on the screen, right? So perhaps it's integrated with LSP, right? So that you could get completions or go to definition or find references. These things are more than just grep, right? Which is a useful tool and I use a lot, right? But it needs to be more than just that. It needs to understand the text at some sort of semantic level. That semantic level can vary and may not be as semantically understood as something like Java and IntelliJ, right? I think there's very few tools that understand code as well as IntelliJ for Java, right? But it needs to know something, and LSP is a pretty good standard. That's what Neovim has, and it's been working great for me. Beyond that, though, there's two unique aspects for PDEs that I think are also part of this requirement, which is that PDEs provide a playground for you to compose a bunch of tools together. Now, the composition is very important. So in Neovim, for example, right, this means that we might use something like ripgrep within Neovim to be able to generate a list of references to this string, right? Okay, that's very cool. We don't rewrite grep to use it inside of Vim, right? We compose other tools in sort of the Unix style to be able to do those things together. Even LSP, in a sense, is a composition of a tool, right? Because for Neovim, you can just get the references of something under your cursor and you could display those in a variety of different ways. You could pipe them through Telescope, or you could put them in the quick fix list, or all these different things, right? Each of those things is an example of composing different tools together to provide an experience that's greater than the sum of its parts, right? But beyond that, a PDE must be scriptable and extensible by the end user, and not just sort of as a thing that exists. But I would say for a thing to be a PDE, it is required that the majority of users do some scripting and or extending of the editor themselves. For Vim, this is really obvious that people do this all the time because your vimrc or your init.vim, that's just scripting, right, as part of your configuration. But that part of it is where personalization starts to come in. And I think the Vim way and the Emacs way too of sort of these scripting as just part of your regular configuration is that step that you need to get to more advanced scripting within the editor. I don't consider something like IntelliJ to be scriptable because I don't think the majority of users write their own extension, for example, right, within IntelliJ. So that scriptability is also that scripting is ubiquitous among users. However, there is one more requirement that I sort of think is essential when we think about PDEs, and that requirement is that you're having fun. When you're configuring, when you're learning new stuff, when you're trying to write your own plugin, when you're exploring new key combinations, that should be fun for you. If it's not fun, I sort of refer back to some assembly required. Perhaps PDEs just aren't your style. And that's not a dig. That's not saying you're not as good of a dev or anything like that. A bunch of devs that I super respect and I think ship amazing products that do great businesses, they use the default thing for Sublime. They don't spend any time configuring their editor, and they don't think that that's any fun. And they make fun of me for spending my weekends doing that instead of launching a new business. And that's okay. But I don't picture that as sort of like an alternative. For me, doing things with my editor, exploring it, doing those things, it's like a playground for writing interesting code that I find useful. I get to write code for a customer who I know pretty well. And so for me, it's an opportunity to learn more about API design, to think about performance in different settings, for all these different aspects. I'm having fun doing that. And that's not for everyone, and that's okay. But I do think it is sort of one of the requirements of this whole PDE experience, and where a big disconnect happens for a lot of people because they think, that doesn't look fun to me. And I would say, yes, that's okay. It doesn't have to look fun to you for it to be fun for me, right? I hope that that's clear and what I'm saying makes sense, because it's okay for someone else to have fun in a way that you don't think is fun. And that's part of this PDE thing. Beyond that, I'm going to take this time to do a separate rant, because for me, it's important to recognize I don't think that making an argument that PDEs are faster is a good argument. And notice that I didn't say anything about speed or loading times or anything else like that in any of the requirements that I've said so far, because I think most of those arguments are pretty worthless. One of the main reasons that I think that is, if you're not having fun, if you're not enjoying the assembly required, you will be really slow in your editor because you're not going to master it for PDEs, right? And then you will stay stuck there and you will not enjoy coding or do other things that allow you to improve your speed. And so you'll end up just saying like, oh, I used Vim for 2 years and it sucked, and now I switched to something else, right? You're not going to get any faster. Whereas for me, when I look at my editor, I'm interested in getting 1% better every day because I'm having fun. And so over 5 years, I might be at a spot where I'd be faster if I was using something else. That's true, right? I might be faster than even if I was using IntelliJ for that whole time or something, right? And trying to master that. So ultimately, I think speed or ability to do things in a particular tool is personal and personality dependent. So I don't think it makes sense to tell other people,
you would be faster if you were using Vim.
What kind of stupid thing is that? Maybe they wouldn't be having any fun. Whenever people ask, should I use Neovim on stream? I ask them, do you enjoy tinkering with things? Do you have fun spending time exploring? If you do, you might like that. But if what you want to do is sit down and code and get your company shipped quickly, why would you take a detour to do Neovim? That doesn't make any sense at all. So I can't answer that question for you. That's part of things being personalized. So that's the end of my little side rant. Please, if you're a fan of Neovim, don't try and make Neovim's faster arguments. Just say why you like it and let other people decide for themselves. Anyways, let's go ahead and move on. Let's see if Neovim can meet the requirements that I've laid out to be a PDE. The first thing is, of course, Neovim can do all of the basic things that people expect from a text editor, right? Which is, it can do syntax highlighting, folding, movements, all this good stuff, right? It can do all those. And I don't think anyone, even the actually crowd, has anything to say about whether Neovim can or can't do that. It can do all of those things. That's great. So that's sort of a check on basics, right? But let's move on to something more interesting, thinking about how does Neovim try and tackle the ideas of scriptability and extensibility. The first thing is that Neovim ships with its own API. This API is very robust and is getting added to more and more over time. And it allows you as a user to be able to control Neovim over a remote protocol or via Lua. In this case, it does something very simple. It takes the current buffer and it sets all the lines to the lines, first line and second line. This API has a lot of contracts and guarantees that make it really useful over the long term for users and exposes a lot of consistency of Neovim internals. This allows us to do a lot of exciting things like Luify sort of every aspect of the user experience within Neovim. So that means settings, key maps, commands, auto commands, and more as time goes on. This idea of the scripting is configuration and configuration is scripting, while not perfect for every scenario, at least gives you some of the idea about how, as you start to understand, how do I do settings? You're like, oh, when I learn how to do that for my personal configuration, I also learn how to do that for plugins or for more advanced scenarios, right? So each one is sort of like a building block on top of this universal API within Lua. Beyond that, though, we have powerful tools exposed via Lua, like Tree Sitter. So Tree Sitter is generally sort of known as this thing that does syntax highlighting, but Tree Sitter does a lot more than just highlights. What it does is it's a library for writing grammars to basically expose syntax trees in a unified format, which lets you understand the code structurally. And so why don't I show you a few examples of some cool stuff we can do with Tree Sitter inside of Neovim. So the first thing that I want to show you is an example of how we can use Tree Sitter to generate snippets. And so in this case, what we're going to do is, and this is a bit overly complicated, but I just want to show you that it's not sort of hocus pocus. It really does actually do something quite interesting, which is in Go, it's common that you need to call some function, and if that function returns an error, you return the error and then defaults for everything else of whatever function you're inside of. And so in this case, basically, I've got a function here, and I want to call example function down here, okay? And so if I wanted to do that, and I wanted to handle whether I had an error or not from example function, I can take this snippet here, and I could say value is the value that I have, error is the new error that I'm calling. I can move to the next one and say example function. And then notice how inside of here, I've generated the corresponding sort of defaults for, or the 0 values for whatever types are within the return type of the current function that I'm in. So note that I'm actually in like main, and then I'm in another anonymous function inside of anonymous function, right? So this actually uses Tree Sitter to determine, hey, what are the things being returned by whatever the nearest function scope that I'm in, and then return the default values for those as part of the snippet. And I can jump through these, and I can even switch to say whether I want that wrapped or not, depending on what error library we're using at the time. And then I can move through that and continue going. Now, that's a snippet that I wrote for myself, and it queries Tree Sitter to understand what's happening sort of at a structural level. And we can actually take a look to see that this tree that's built inside of Neovim actually understands a bunch of what's happening with this code, and I can ask what the result of this function is. That's how I get each of these different types to make my own snippet. That's just an example of how when we can start composing the API, the sort of unified language built on top of the API and Tree Sitter, we can start to do very exciting things. So that's just one example of Tree Sitter. It can do many more things. It can do things like expanded selection based on scopes. It can do highlighting, all the highlighting that's provided here. It can determine when you should indent. It can determine folding. It can actually determine sort of the context of the current function that you're in. It can do many, many more things. But I just wanted to show you at least one very interesting one. Let's move on to the next thing. So the next thing that I want to show you is just a really brief introduction to LSP within Neovim. This knows much more than just the text, right? So if you're familiar with LSP, some of these things won't really surprise you, but I do want to at least show them and show what's possible. So some stuff that we can do with LSP is we can request, hey, I'd like to get all of the workspace symbols, fuzzy find over those, and move to the one that matches. That part's pretty cool. We can also ask for the references of that. And that is also piped through Telescope, which is a fuzzy finder that I helped write. And it's quite cool because we can move between those very quickly and easily between the different references. Not only that, we also get information back from the LSP about things that you might want to do for this particular file. So for example, we can run the current test by typing run, and we can run it. We can see that, this test passed and it ran successfully. We can then move to the next one to show that this one fails, right? By running the same thing again, and run this test and show, oh, this time it said that we would get 6, but we got 5. And so that's an example of how we can run those tests as well within the editor. And we're doing that basically through LSP and code lenses. So that gives us power to understand the text also as more at a more intelligent level, and to do the kinds of things that you'd expect from an IDE. Go to definition. We can rename things to call this example, right? Even though we have, or we could rename this to be X, and then notice how we have the same X up here and down here, the same name, but they're not the same variable. If I rename this back to say NVim is cool, of course, you know, a good name. Notice that we didn't rename this X, right? LSP understands that those X's are in different scopes, and so when we rename one, we shouldn't rename the other. This works across files as long as the LSP supports that as well. And LSPs are progressively getting better and better over time, which is very cool to see. And that's sort of just the basics, just scratching the surface of what's possible to do with Neovim. And what I think is the best part about it is that I can't tell you what you are going to find fun or interesting to do. That's part of this whole idea of having it be a personalized development environment. I write snippets that I find useful for me. I write shortcuts that are useful for me. I write even plugins that I find are useful for me. Some people happen to share some of the same things, and then we might end up collaborating or doing different things together to make it even better, which is awesome. And that's sort of in the spirit of open source. And I've learned a lot from that, sort of with Neovim as the testing ground of that for me. But ultimately, I'm not here to convince you that Neovim's awesome and great. What I really want to try and convince you is that this term PDE is at least useful for people to think about and to sort of grow in our understanding and conversations about text editors or development environments in general. And so ultimately, my goal was to expose you to a new term, to make you maybe think in a new way. And I hope that I was able to make that happen. If you liked this talk or you'd like to see more of them, let me know in the comments. If you have any questions about how I did anything that I did, I will try and write other talks about that. And coming soon will be a talk about how you can make Neovim into an IDE really quickly as sort of a base ground to start building your own PDE for Neovim. Thanks everybody. I really appreciate you watching the video all the way through. And if you could, smash that like button, give it a subscribe, and let your friends know. I hope PDE becomes a term that allows us all to have a little bit more clarity when we're and plugins in the Neovim ecosystem. And today, what I want to show you is how to take Neovim from not configured to an instant IDE in 30 seconds or less. So before getting started with actually configuring Neovim, you need to install it. It's actually pretty simple to install. If you go to github.com/neovim/neovim, click on the wiki, click on installing Neovim. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. In general, I prefer building it from source, but you can also download from the releases or, as mentioned here, install the updates, build from source, and install for yourself. That's step number 1 in the process. After you've installed, you should have some way to start Neovim on your system. That's probably something like typing nvim. Now, when you do that, have some way to start Neovim on your system. That's probably something like typing nvim. You to use Neovim. You already clicked on the video, so I'm assuming you have some interest in learning it. But in general, I don't think proselytizing technologies is a super productive use of my time. I'd rather write my own configs. You might think that that's a waste of time, but at least it makes me happy. Convincing you to use Neovim does not. So instead, what we'll do is I'll just give you some of the reasons that I like using Neovim, and maybe some of them will resonate with you. And if not, that's totally fine. You can go watch Prime Read instead of this. So I find it super satisfying to make things do exactly what I want them to do. we're going to show in this video that it's actually super easy to download, build, and install Neovim in approximately a minute. And so you could even go so far as very easily changing and customizing Neovim itself. Now, it might be annoying to keep the patches up and all this other stuff, but that's the level of flexibility that we have when we're exploring with Neovim. I also find sort of the flip side of this. There's the hacking side, which is in itself fun, but there's also the eliminating annoying things. And I don't know if you're like me, little annoying things have sort of an outsized impact on my day-to-day experiences, right? If I have to do something over and over that I really don't like doing, it bothers me. And, this is sort of a character flaw, but it bothers me more than it really should. So using Neovim and allowing sort of this avenue for me to turn those annoyances into either things that I think are cool that I've sort of conquered or things that I no longer think about because we've completely automated them, that's a really valuable thing for the long-term health of my development. Now, yeah, Mr. YouTuber talking about my development. I still write code, believe it or not, and I want to keep writing code for a long time. And the last little bit here is like the whole modal editing thing, which we'll cover in one of the first few days here of Advent of Neovim. It really clicks with my brain. Instead of having huge key, sort of like chords or other things like this, we just can use a language to describe how we want to interact with the editor, which is what text objects and verbs and actions really are, is sort of like a little mini language that you can learn to communicate with. It really clicks with my brain and works really well. So there's a few other reasons too. I like that it's properly open source. I like that there's no secret incentives to try and get you to buy into cloud platforms or AI tooling, stuff along these lines. But those are sort of secondary aspects and definitely not the primary motivators of how I got into and why I was using Neovim. I do remember the very first time that I found out Neovim existed. I was, I think, college senior at the time. And I found out that you could write Python and it could change what was happening inside of your editor. And that blew my mind. At the time, all I had really experienced, Eclipse. That was it. I was pretty much used Eclipse and that was all. So I was really blown away by Neovim. And that sort of stumbled me into a long path of now apparently, making YouTube videos and streaming and doing other stuff. So that's sort of why I use it. Maybe those make sense to you, maybe they don't, but that's kind of the general idea. So how are we going to get started? Well, you have to get Neovim. That's the first thing. Pretty easy. You can go to the Neovim website here, and it's got a bunch of different options linked in the description for these slides as well. And you can click install, but personally, I really think building Neovim from source is the way to go, and it's pretty easy. So you can just make sure you install the build prerequisites. That's kind of an important bit, but if you've done that, you could go to something like here and just clone this in. I'm just going to do depth 1 just so that we can clone this quickly. We'll go back to here and it says, hey, cd into Neovim and make it. Okay, cool. That's nice. So now we're making Neovim. And keep in mind, this is downloading a bunch of external dependencies and pulling all of these in and all that good stuff. And it's still going to be very fast. We'll give it a second. But the reason that I'm showing this is because if you understand how this works, you can really easily, check out different tags or different versions or get the latest version or roll back your version. All of those things are super easy if you start to understand how to build this for yourself. And of course, later, then you could look at like, how does the Lua LSP work inside of here? Oh, okay, we can do this, right? So that's great. So now we've built it, and now we just need to download or install it here. So we can install this, and now this would be installed. And I already have Neovim obviously on my machine, but this would be building and installing again. And so this is a complete from scratch build. These are much faster if you do this later because you've already downloaded all the external dependencies. But there you go. Basically within a minute, you can have the latest Neovim, and it's even faster once you want to update that for yourself. So that's the very beginning part here. The next thing we want to note is, hey, what are you going to do? How do you start doing anything inside of the editor? So if you're on Linux or Mac, this is in config nvim init lua, and it's some similar thing in Windows. I don't know. I've never done that. And so here we go. We can open our Neovim, and I'm actually going to do just a little bit of a trick here, I would say, which is we can make an nvim app name, and we'll just call this example. We'll call it nvim example.
and we'll open Neovim. And now this is basically a fresh and clean Neovim. This NVim app name is a trick for those of you who are a bit professionals or have some, maybe some other configs to completely separate your Neovim configs if you're trying to test out different ideas. So this has literally nothing inside of it. So for you, you would go to cd config nvim. I'm going to go to nvim example. That doesn't exist yet, so we'll make it dir nvim example. cd into here. And this is what you would do if you had the same thing. And now we can do nvim app name here, and we'll edit init lua. You'll just run nvim init lua if you're in the correct directory for you. Okay, sweet. Now we can do something like print hello world. Or maybe hello, we'll say advent of Neovim. Now you might be saying, okay, I just opened Neovim for the first time. I don't know how to do anything. Good point. You can press I to go to insert mode. Okay, you'll see how it says insert in the bottom left right now. Then you can start typing just like you would normally. Okay, we'll explain a little bit more of this in the next day. But you can start typing. Just type the way you would of Neovim here. Okay, and when you're done typing in insert mode, you can press escape or control C, or we'll write remaps for that later for those of you who don't have, SICK, Dactyl, Maniform, Ortholinear keyboards. And then once you're back in that, you're no longer in insert mode, so now you're in normal mode. And interestingly, it's called normal mode because this is where you'll normally be spending your time. And that's maybe a little bit different from some of the ideas that maybe you're used to, but that's totally okay. And once you've done that, you'll see this little plus sign. This means, hey, you've got changes that aren't saved. This is where maybe you would be confused because you're saying, where's my save button, or why isn't it auto saving? We'll get to those eventually. But we need to send a command. The way that we tell Neovim how to do commands is we type a colon. You'll see now we have this little colon, and we're right down here. And we can just type write. Now, or just W, but write at first will kind of give you what you're doing. And see how that goes away, and it tells you that it was written. And now we can do this little quit. Great. If I open Neovim up again, you'll see, hey, we printed that line twice because that's what we printed. If we want to delete this line, we can just tap D twice, DD. That deletes it. We'll write again, and then we will quit. Okay, and when we open Neovim again like this, we'll see in messages, advent of Neovim. Awesome. So that's basically everything I wanted to cover in this first round, right? Which is just how do we do this? The last little tidbit is you're saying, okay, I want to start writing some of my own code. I don't really want to restart completely every single time. Well, that's pretty easy too. The way that we can do this is if we open this up, we can do source %. % is sort of like a placeholder for this current file. And we can see that we wrote this. If we write something here again by saying hello, and we source %, it's going to run this whole file top to bottom. One thing that's cool though is if we want to visually select something, like once again, you just relax. Don't worry, we'll cover visual selections later. For right now, just do something like Shift V to visually select this line. We press colon again to send us into command mode and write Lua. This will actually just run what we've selected. So if we select these and we just do Lua, only the 2 lines that we're running will get executed. But this is pretty cool too because you could do something like, and relax, we'll get here. My cool function is function, print hello, and like this. And if we select this, we could now call my cool function and it will print hello. So all of that is sort of the very basics of how we can start editing text inside of Neovim by going into insert mode, escaping back to normal mode, writing, and quitting. Tomorrow, we'll take our next step on our Neovim journey. If you think this is a cool video, if you don't mind the random rants in the middle, let me know in the comments. I'm going to try out something different.
مم. ليه يونس ما أدري. آه.